What's the plan, Tesla? Welcome back.
Cyberspace
Podcast. Empirical trainers. Do you know what I mean? So like empirical trainers.
Welcome back to the Cyberspace podcast.
Empirical trainers.
Yeah, actually, I like that. Sweet.
Hello and welcome back to the Cyberspace podcast by Empirical Training. My name's Josh. I'm one of the Empirical Trainers, and we're really focused on helping people break into cybersecurity, improve and advance their existing cybersecurity careers, or just improve their general privacy and day-to-day security as we all face threats on a regular basis. So you may have seen us on TikTok, Instagram, the social medias, sharing tips and tricks there. You might be even in our Discord or school communities where we get direct access to us, where we helped a lot of people refine their CVs, test out their interview skills, and ultimately help people get into jobs. That's the real reward that we get to see on a regular basis. So this podcast is all about just talking to different people who are within cybersecurity, who have interesting stories of their backgrounds, who might have some insights and tidbits as to how you can advance yours, and really show that there's a broad variety of people who are in the cybersecurity space. There isn't just one route into here, right? There are very, very many, as well as just talking about what is really interesting us in the cybersecurity world at the moment. So without further ado, I'm joined by James Stanger from CompTIA. James is Dr. James Stanger. Forgive me for that. That's a little slip up. 20 years.
No problem.
20 years security consultant, presenter, certification and curriculum designer. I believe you've also won numerous awards for some of your work as an author, blogger, and presenter, including presenting at RSA and NCSC, the UK cybersecurity agency. So really pleased to have you on here with your experience.
It's great to be here, man. It's great to be here. In fact, I'll be in town in May, so I'm looking forward to that. It's always great to get back to the UK.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you're Mr. Worldwide, right? I think we met first at one of the CompTIA partner events.
That's right.
Yeah, I caught you just before. Actually, you're the first person I saw when I came in, and it was which is a bit of a stroke of luck. And I got a preview of the talk you were giving that day around gaps.
That's right. Talk about gaps. It's so funny when it comes to people talk about the skills gap all the time, right? And I think sometimes it's not a nuanced conversation. Sometimes it is, a lot of times it isn't. And a lot of times when they talk about the skills gap, it's like they're pointing fingers, and what's the old saying? Mom used to say, if you point a finger, you have fingers pointing back at you and all that.
Yeah.
Because when you say the skills gap, it's kind of like accusatory of maybe the people looking for a gig, looking for a job. And I think there are more gaps than that. I think it's more of a confidence gap, not only learners, like knowing where to start when it comes to cybersecurity or whatever. I think there's a gap for people who are just transitioning from having learned or having proven what they're doing to people getting a job. I think there's also a confidence gap out there. This is probably the biggest problem of IT hiring managers. People in IT, they know their stuff and everything, but the way businesses tend to be run with IT, I think there's a lot of friction there. There's, I'm kind of going off here, but it's really interesting to me to see all of these different gaps there. And I think that's what kind of drives the fact that there are a lot of organizations out there looking for workers, not just a skills gap. It's kind of a confidence gap issue.
Yeah, I think that's what's really interesting about that talk, right? Because the skills gap is what we always hear talked about, and so it's almost the kind of that final product of all those other pieces, the gaps before the big gap. And confidence gap, I think, is a really interesting one, because that's something. When I started my career in cybersecurity, I talk about it fairly regularly, that how terrified I was, even once I'd got given the go ahead, that I was going to miss something crucial in the data. I was doing a relatively insignificant job to start with, as you'd expect, but I generally was scared every day that I was going to have an impact that would result in data exfiltration or mass compromise. But what else that conjured in my mind is, as well, the confidence analyst is the confidence of the hiring manager, or even maybe the higher up execs, the boards, in what they can get out of security, confidence in the people to deliver, or maybe even overconfidence or over expectation. That can be a real challenge sometimes. We see loads of people trying to go for maybe their first jobs, who seem to have a lot of the skills on paper. They run security labs at home. They have Security Onion, OSEC agents. They're basically doing their own threat detection and response program on the side. And they get turned down because they don't have a bachelor degree, 2 years experience or whatever they require.
It's so funny, that whole years of experience or the bachelor's degree requirement. Isn't it interesting how aspirational some of those job descriptions are? It was one of the first things when I see people getting into the profession, it scares them. And I think they self-cancel themselves and they go, well, I read the rec, I read the job advertisement and it asked for so much more than what I have. But I think a lot of that's aspirational on the part of the hiring manager. Don't you?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, you don't ask, don't get, I guess, is one of the things. They want to attract the best minds
I think you're right. Yeah. Yeah. I think, in other words, it's so often, there are a couple of things here, because when you're hired as a cybersecurity person, your job is to, on some level, manage risk, right? And so, of course, you can't be, if you're a job person putting the advertisement out there, the job advertisement, you can't be casual about it. It's like, well, it's a security analyst job, very important. I love that, the whole idea of security analytics. But it's easy to overspec a job rec because it is important. It's managing risk, and so of course you're going to overspec that. So I remember talking to a friend of mine. He works for Google. He's the I can't remember, senior director of threat hunting, basically over at Google right now. And
is that
he
from
said,
the kind of Mandiant
he showed
side,
me
right?
a job.
Yeah. Sorry, is that the Mandiant
Yeah.
side?
The guy he came from Mandiant. Yeah. He came from Mandiant and then went over and worked for a retail company called Target, and then he's now over at Google. So he worked for Mandiant before it was a Google thing. And so he said he showed me a job and he said, James, check this out. He goes, this is a guy with like 30 years of experience, serious experience. And he showed basically a mid to junior to mid-level SOC analyst job. And he's like, I don't know if I could get that job. And it paid like a sixth of what he makes now.
Oh, wow.
And I'm not saying that, I'm not trying to say that, oh, well, that's because his somehow career got inflated or whatever. It really has to do with overspeccing. So when I would say when people looking for that gig, consider that job rec as a negotiation and try to bring something unique that you have and real that you have in your resume, in your cover letter and all that. And that can begin the negotiation. I'm not talking about salary negotiation. I'm talking about skills negotiation at this point. You know what I mean?
Yeah. That's really interesting. We were talking to one of our community members a couple of days ago, actually, and he was saying that applying for jobs is like psychological warfare because he's been turned down so many times and he was struggling to just keep on going. But back to what you said, I want to ask a question of you.
Tough.
Yeah, it is. You said that kind of over being demanding too much on the job spec. What do you think the reason for that is? Is that because they want the top, or is it because they are outcome gapped and they're just trying to fill it as much as possible? Do they not know? Are they overstretching people? What are your thoughts?
I think there's part of that. I think there's also an anxiety on the part of the hiring manager going, if I hire the wrong person, then we're all going to be in trouble, right? I think there's that. I think there's also it's just part of the culture to over expect and overwrite it. It's so there are many reasons, but I think there is, well, that's just what we do. And a lot of times, and people all love to blame the HR person. Well, the HR person doesn't really know what's going on, but a lot of those job recs are not created by the HR person. They are created by an interaction between the hiring manager and HR. But I think they get a template going. And by a template, I mean, there's, some sort of a list, a description, and that might be a year old, 5 years old or something. And then instead of throwing stuff out and adding things to it, you just keep adding things to it. It's what I call the cruft factor. Programmers, right? Cruft is, stuff that's been added on and, just kind of things get a little messy and they don't, shed some of that stuff. I think that's another one of the problems.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, so maybe the cybersecurity programs, they're working harder, not smarter. Because one of the things that we see all the time, like I have a lot of friends who are now in various different friends, former colleagues, now friends who work in different areas of cybersecurity. Now, some of them for large SOCs, some of them in really small ones. The thing I've really noticed, the people in smaller SOCs, they are asked to do a lot. There's not as much going on at any given moment, but they are asked to kind of cover all bases. There's only so many hours in a day, right? They can only focus on a certain, which of these are the highest priority, and that gap the gap of the expectation, the actual what is, well, I couldn't tell you which of these is more important. I just know we need to do all of these things. It's a real thing. And then I think also burnout is something we see. There's a huge turnover. I think it's maybe 2 or 3 years is the average retention for an analyst, and it's often kind of pointed at it's people being greedy, moving over to greener pastures, and if you aren't getting remunerated what you should, then horizontal moves are great for that. But I think it's also a lot of that kind of being overworked, right? If you're doing a lot of work, you aren't seeing the benefits of it, which is really difficult in security, right? Because the benefit is nothing happens, right? It's business as usual a lot of the time.
Yeah, the no news is good news, and so you're not appreciated. I think there's a big thing about. I often hear this because of my particular gig at CompTIA. We do education and certification and stuff like that. And I've heard for decades. Well, what happens is if I upskill my people and they leave, right? That's a bad thing. If I train my people or upskill my people, I invest in them, and then suddenly, Josh, you take off on me. You know what I mean? Because you have additional skills. I would argue that obviously stuff like that happens. We know that.
Yeah.
But I would argue usually folks don't leave because they get upskilled. Usually they don't really, they're leaving because they're getting away from something, not going to something. Or to put it another way, they are going to an environment that's healthier on some level. IT burnout's a real thing. And I think for IT workers, cybersecurity workers, developers, it doesn't matter, across the board. I see that as a real thing. There's one of my coworkers at CompTIA. Her husband went into teaching, got out of IT, been working in IT for 20 something years. They didn't want him to go, but he got into teaching because he found, maybe I can get in an environment that is a little less, I'll use the word toxic, or a little less crazy. And I think that's a reality in IT departments. And that could be another thing, in my opinion, another nuance that has to do with the hiring gap or whatever you want to call it. Because if you're constantly, as a cybersecurity worker or as an IT worker, in an environment where processes aren't mature, you know what I mean, Josh? Well, here's how we do things, and how we do things on some level makes sense. If you don't have that, you have a chaos factor or whatever that does lead to burnout. And I think that's tough to hire into an environment like that. I mean, Josh, if you're in an environment where you need a pen tester, or you need an incident responder, or in a smaller environment, a good security engineer generalist, and yet you don't feel you have control over your environment, how much do you really feel like hiring someone? Right? Do you want to bring somebody into that kind of chaotic thing? Sometimes you have to, but these are some of the issues. There are ways out of it. There really are, but those are realities out there. Yeah.
Yeah, I think what that kind of conjured to my mind. I've been more. Some of the other people in been on here more in the hiring position. I've been more on the you're going to go move cybersecurity jobs, and when you're in them, the kind of the thing that I heard from that kind of scaled over was that frustration of saying, I know we need to do this. I know we need to take this seriously. And then trying to, I was at a conference the other week and we were talking to some cybersecurity CISO leaders, all those type of people for some large UK companies across the board. And we talked about having security across hybrid environments. So how do you approach the hybrid problem, right? We've got locations in UK and in Germany, wherever you've got public cloud, you might have private cloud, you've got SaaS, you've got different technologies. All this, we need to have a unified approach. We started the conversation there, some kind of common things about asset discovery, visibility, collecting telemetry. Where we ended up was talking about having stakeholder buy-in to actually agree to kind of prioritize these things and take the time to, it's not a sexy feature when you go and deploy security. You can't write a press release about it. As an analyst, it's incredibly frustrating, or any sort of security professional, when you're trying to advocate for these things. And then a few months, days, weeks, whatever, down the line, it kind of does hit the fan, and you're sitting there with a super high pressure war room scenario. You're probably working over your hours, and you're getting that resolved there and then, and you're just thinking, wow, this would be so much easier if we'd addressed the visibility problems we had months ago, or we put more controls in place to kind of segregate or mitigate this type of threat. So yeah, I think that's I know disagreements go down well on podcasts, and I couldn't really disagree with that. It's a good point. But I wanted to offer the position of the analyst and how they can kind of feel that similar gap with what it is they're doing, what the organization's priorities might be.
No, makes sense. Makes sense. I think one of the biggest things that as you look for a gig, a lot of people they focus on the idea of well, you mentioned Security Onion earlier. I'm glad you did that, by the way. It's
Yeah.
a very cool tool. I love using that as a security analytics tool and as a teaching tool. But I think the real issue or the real opportunity as a person looking to get hired is to show what I call the X factor, right? Or anybody would call it X factor. It's there's kind of implied stuff in a job interview, and one of the things that's implied is the importance of really solid communication and somebody who understands why they're doing something, not just doing something. Like you could talk about Security Onion as a technical skill, or Linux, or you could talk about from a pen testing perspective or from a cloud perspective, some of the really cool tools that are out there. But really what organizations are looking for is somebody who can bring organization to chaos, who can communicate. And I think that level of communication and that if they know you can bring that to the table and have had experience doing that, I think that's something that is going to get past the automatic resume scanners. It's
Oh
going to
yeah.
get past the initial triage that happens when it comes to resumes. I
Yeah.
think bringing that in there is a really important factor.
It's a really good point. I think it's something that we often talk about is that the softer skills that when you first embark on
Yeah.
getting cybersecurity, you dive into the technical pieces like you said, but it's really the having that communication to link what you're doing to an outcome, to what happens if you don't do this. Right? You can link almost any cybersecurity task that's worth doing back to revenue or growth for an organization. Right? If the data's stolen, you lose reputation, you lose your intellectual property. Bad.
Mhm.
If your systems are taken down by ransomware or they need to be re-imaged because they're infected and riddled with malware, people can't work. That loss of revenue down. And so I think it doesn't always have to be at that level. I'm not saying make sure you can always communicate to the impact of the organization, but being a security analyst is about in that chaos of the data. There is so much data within there, and it's making sense of it, but not just making sense of it for yourself, making sense of it for other people. It's a real team sport as well, right? It took me years to realize when I was doing investigations and I wasn't finding anything, I thought I was bad at investigations. What I then realized was I should be documenting everything I've looked at and where I haven't found anything, because actually that is as valuable. It's not as fun. It doesn't you get the same dopamine rush when you find the threat, but it's valuable to the investigation and the security outcome. That I looked here, there was nothing. So let's focus elsewhere. Try a different hypothesis. James, I want to ask you a question because I know you're a huge, and you please comment on that if you want to. I don't mean to cut you off, but I know you're a big advocate for open source. We talked about Security Onion there. Do you want to give us a little overview of open sources, but then also talk about some of those other tools or project people can use to kind of give them that experience, right? Give them that X factor, make them stand out.
You bet. You bet. The great thing about open source, it has its drawbacks as well. There's nothing that's perfect in the world, right? But one of the great things about open source is I see it as a great development model. The idea is that as you create code, instead of you saying, well, that's mine, I have a copyright, they made a joke decades ago saying, well, let's make a copy left, right? But the idea is that instead of taking that code and keeping it secret, you basically create the code and you put it in the public domain and you legally protect it. And there are various licenses out there, like just Google this GPL, the new public license. And there are dozens of these licenses. Some are more popular than the other, and there are versions of these licenses. But the big thing is that it keeps the code in the public domain, and it means that every time somebody contributes to it, that code then has to be contributed in the public domain. This code finds itself in lots of places that can be good and bad, usually good, meaning that there are so many tools that are out there. If you've heard of the cloud before, right? Open source software powers the cloud. There's just no question. I don't care if it's Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud, AWS. These are the serverless stuff that you see up there, all the AI tools. It's all Linux. I was talking to a lady who's one of the vice presidents over at Red Hat. And she was saying, just look at virtually every sector. I mean, not even virtually, literally every segment, whether it be from a technical perspective, grid computing, clusters, storage, the web, you just name it. All of that is powered by open source type stuff. And the idea, if you have an Android, which I do, I prefer Android. That's
too.
a Linux. It's a hacked up Linux version. Do you have that or?
Yeah, I'm not going to say the model because there's enough data about me on the public domain.
So yeah, true enough. Yeah, here I'll show you my phone real quick. Yeah, there you go. But even if you have an iPhone, right? That's FreeBSD. Yeah, Unix, right, which is open source again. So it's virtually everywhere. And the great idea is that I think was it Torvalds, Linus Torvalds, that say, given enough eyes, all bugs are shallow. I think I quoted him correctly there. And that's an ideal statement. But the idea is that if you have 10,000 people, looking at the code, eventually somebody's going to go, well, I can do that better. And that's a quality thing. Or you can say, well, do you realize you wrote a buffer overflow in there? Maybe we ought to get that out of there. This fails. Sometimes we've seen, log4j, which is open source way of doing things. Messaging, logging, things like that. And that log4j found itself in so many projects and so many open source tools that caused a huge problem. Or there's the shell shock. These are old old problems, but they got fixed, didn't they? And they got discovered. So it's a great software development model. There are a lot of tools out there. Security Onion is a set of a dozen different tools that work together to help create a security, a free security operations center tool. There's Linux, there's Metasploit, there's Kali Linux, Parrot Linux. These are flavors of Linux that are all set up for pen testers, for example. Wireshark.
Kali have got a new version out, I think, actually. I just saw someone share that post. I mean, probably we're a few weeks late when this goes out, but I'm looking forward to diving into that. It's been a while since I've spun up a Kali Linux instance. But yeah, I definitely want to let you carry on with where you're at, but that's standing on the shoulders of giants is really what I think of with open source, right? It's everybody kind of for the greater good.
Great way to put it.
Creating some code, building something and allowing people to build upon that. As you said, it has huge benefits, but also then it's sometimes it's a lot of eyes on something when it does go wrong. Log4j, for example, is like ants to the honey when they found out there was a vulnerability, and then we saw like three related vulnerabilities, emerging threats come straight out of that as people piled their attention into it. But yeah, these tools are really powerful. Like Security Onion, I was actually diving into, I won't say who it was, but I was diving into some kind of technical documentation for a global security provider. And I realized their agent was OSEC and WASA. They were using the open source pieces. And there are so many open source components of, you mentioned Google and Android, Apple and Android, iOS, but also in security programs. These tools are good enough. They're not Mickey Mouse tools. They really are what people are actually using.
Yeah, they have to be implemented correctly. One of the big problems with IoT is that a lot of open source stuff, when I say IoT, whether it be smartwatches or probably webcams and more, I'll use the word fungible, more disposable things, right? Because they're cheaper. Of course, See, and what these companies will do is they'll grab open source software and then put it on there because one of the great things, if it's free and if it's licensed properly, there's no what's the word, liability, right? And so if you take that stuff, but then what they do is they'll put an entire stack, like almost an entire Linux system into a very simple device that has no ability for passwords. It has no ability to be updated. You can't update the network stack in this little IoT device. The IoT device then kind of just keeps living around the internet, and this causes all sorts of problems. So that's in broad terms some of the issues that can happen with open source as well. Like anything, if you have access to these things, it has to be managed properly, and there's a business side of managing that properly. There's a technical side of it.
Yeah, I think that I really didn't know that was the legal liability wasn't there. I thought it was just a little bit laziness, that people didn't care enough to actually go and challenge these companies that don't put, a password or a way to change the password on my baby monitor.
It's funny. You say that, though. A lot of customers out there, people who buy this stuff they're consumers and they see it as a consumable device. Most people don't want to be an IT manager to their, to their baby's
They
baby
expect
monitor.
it to work.
You know what I mean? They expect it to work. And so, and of course, companies will say, well, we expect it to sell, right? And so if you expect it to work and you expect it to sell, there's a kind of a flavor, as it were, of irresponsibility on both sides of that, right? And so you end up with this device that kind of lives on and keeps on giving. It gets enlisted in a botnet or what have you. These are the kinds of issues. In fact, one time, this is a long time ago, I remember talking to a group. They were U.S. government led, and they go around bricking things, literally finding, they know what these IoT devices, feel like and sound like on the web, on the internet, and they'll go around and find ways to brick them. And I'm like, do you have permission from the vendor to do that? And these are old systems. And he's like, I said, is that legal, illegal? And the guy went, tomato, tomato. We're just trying to get rid of systems that can be enlisted into botnets and eliminate them because they cause problems for us at the DoD.
I love that kind of that's a stretch of offensive security, right? And offensive security is normally about testing things, but actually go hacking back or preemptively hacking devices that could be taken. That's a new take. I've heard of it. It also reminds me of the Log4j example you put out there. I was Googling quickly trying to find how many things were affected, but I believe it was like 3 million developers or 9 million developers.
It was huge. Yeah.
So tons of systems, tons of websites, public facing, were vulnerable to this. And the FBI, all the kind of national cybersecurity agencies had put out strong messages that you need to go and patch this. What I then loved was when it'd been a few weeks and people still hadn't patched. And it's like, wow, this is the biggest vulnerability of the decade, you might say. People still refer to it. And it was a 2021 one, if I remember correctly. They started using the exploit because it's remote code execution. You can do whatever with the exploit to pull down a file from their server. That file was hosting the patch to bring it up to a non-vulnerable version. So they were using the exploit to fix the vulnerability, which I thought was a really ingenious way. And is it legal? Probably not. Yeah. You going to care?
No, the creativity of open source is always intriguing to me. From an instructor perspective, it was always interesting because instead of having to buy very expensive software or mess around with freeware that, cripples itself after 30 days or is pre-crippled or whatever, you have, very powerful tools. But there's also a troubleshooting element and a creativity element and all of that, which is so critical to IT. So that's another reason why I think open source from an education perspective is interesting. From somebody who's just learning about it, you can download VirtualBox, which is open sourced, right? Mm-hmm. It's a virtualization software. VMware, right, is cool, but I like VirtualBox from Oracle. It's very cool. But there's another example, and the idea, you can set up an entire virtual play environment, and you can start messing around with that. Like I've set up systems that were vulnerable to Log4j. I kept them totally isolated to one computer, and then I started throwing rocks at it just to see, is it really that vulnerable? Or more modern versions or problems such as Log4j. And it's really fun to do that because it keeps you on your toes. And organizations very much like people who like to play around. That's a phrase I use with technology. A friend of mine, younger guy, he's about 25 now. And he said that he went into an interview and the interview, he didn't feel it went very well. They asked him, well, what's some of your experience? And he had about 6 months of experience doing some junior level cybersecurity work. This was for a job that was in for a data center, doing some fairly higher end cybersecurity, but also a lot of troubleshooting. And he didn't feel it went very well because he talked about, how he got a computer science degree, and they're like, yeah, okay. And he just felt the temperature of the room was kind of cold. And then something happened. They said, well, what are some of your hobbies? What do you like to do? They want to know what his personality was like a bit, getting into that soft skills thing. And he said, well, I do spend a lot of time gaming, but these days I spend a lot of time breaking into the game device and overclocking the CPU and stuff, which is probably, I don't know if you're supposed to do it, but I like doing it. And he said it was amazing how the temperature of the room went from, sub-zero, like, to, they started leaning forward, and they're like, now what? You overclocked the CPU? It's like, oh yeah, it's not that hard to do. And you do a hardware thing here, and then you do some software things there. And he said it was amazing. He ended up getting the job, and he felt the turning point was not only him sharing his enthusiasm for tech, but when they realized, well, this person likes to, troubleshoot stuff and really knows how things work underneath the hood of the car, as it were. Right. That, to me, that's an X skill. That's an important way of talking about things. And the fact that he was open talking about it, and the fact that he'd actually done something, he didn't think that was relevant at all to the job. He was wrong, because that's what got him the job, or at least got an opening to the conversation. That was kind of cool.
That is something that we always try and instill in people, is that they aren't really looking for the tick box exercise. You talked earlier about that kind of AI HR systems that look for the let's get you past that first stage. In the interview, they want to see, does this person have an affinity for breaking things and fixing things, or finding new solutions to old problems or new problems? That's essential in tech more than any other industry, really, because
No question.
it is it moves on so quickly. New technology, new threats, new techniques. My confidence in the confidence in my security program for yesterday, doesn't matter how good it was, I need to make sure it's good today and good tomorrow. Same for my security people. So I really see that story captures that. I think people don't always realize that if it doesn't have to be a security use case, you just have to show, hey, I like to work out things, I like to find new solutions, I like to improve systems, improve processes. That's a huge thing that people are looking for when they want somebody to, going back to what we said earlier, James, right? The vague job descriptions, asking for too much. Sometimes they don't even know what they need. They want people to come in who are going to help define what is needed, help to carve out roles.
That's a reality. That's absolutely a reality. It's a great point. I think one of the things that tends to happen, I think that's really common in this area, is the fact that they want people to define processes. I agree with that, or at least to contribute to it, because oftentimes IT is a bit more chaotic than anybody wants to admit, and business, the way businesses are organized, are a bit more chaotic than most people want to admit as well. I think in the UK, for example, if you take into account the UK post office scandal that happened, for example, what went on there, we see examples of that throughout the industry. I'm lucky enough to travel the world, and I've seen stories of that happen in the Philippines, in the United States, in Australia. That is not as unique as we'd like to think.
Ooh,
and so good point.
Yeah, I hope that the kind of the attitude to covering it up is maybe a little bit more unique here, but probably not.
I wish. It's put it this way. I think people are starting to wake up, because what's happening is this: a lot of organizations, and I don't care if it's in the UK, I don't care if it's in Europe, if it's in Washington D.C., wherever. We've used technology for decades, and big, huge software projects. We do fine with that, but I think that we have allowed some strange thinking to enter in, and we need to confront it. The idea, first of all, that, well, if the information came from a computer, then it must be right. Well, the computers don't lie. It's like, well, computers do what you're supposed to, what you tell them to do, right?
Yeah.
And so you can't trust everything that comes from a computer. And so as a developer, or as a person who creates code, or as a person who's looking to get hired, if you can show that you can, in a smart way, in a proper way, raise red flags, like, well, what's the procedure for saying, well, maybe we're setting a system up here that is going to be trusted but isn't quite as trustworthy. How do I bring that up? If you can bring that up as an example without trying to come across as a know-it-all, or coming across as somebody who is going to be difficult to work with on some level, it's like, wow, here's a person who's going to cover my butt. You know what I mean? Here's a person who's going to be able to save the day on some level. Yeah. It's those kinds of X skills, I think, that are really important.
Yeah, you want people who can be in the trenches with you, because it's, I'm sure it's not quite as extreme, but
Yeah,
at times it does feel a little bit like that, right? You can have a lot of adversity, a lot of chaos to deal with, as you mentioned. You're going to need people
absolutely.
you can rely on to be creative. Interesting, you say computers don't always tell the truth. I think I like to say computers are stupid, because they only do exactly as they tell. They don't take a value judgment as to whether they should or shouldn't. They just know, oh, I can, and I've been told. Great, and we have to. A lot of what we do is protect them from being told to do certain things. Um,
Yeah, that's right. And they're learning now, I mean, there's systems. I'm not talking about generative AI particularly, but
I knew we were
but
getting
there
there.
there is yeah, there is predictive AI. We've been using it for years. Spam filters, for example,
Mhm.
Amazon in its retail, for example, has been using AI in very sophisticated ways for years. But the fact that you have a computer that can now improve itself, to me,
Yeah,
that's kind of a definition of AI that without human supervision can improve itself. Well, will it improve itself or will it simply morph? Right. And so now you're getting into ideas of training and things like that.
yeah.
But I think one of the other root causes, in addition to computers as it were being dumb, or at least they only work as they are programmed to, is the idea that organizations up until just very recently have kind of gotten away with pushing technology to the margins. And I mean that. It's like, well, how can that be, James? We've been doing, using the web. We're talking via, things like Zoom all the time and all. I mean, we're really sophisticated. I think that organizations have held technology kind of at arm's length for too long.
Mm.
And they can't do that anymore. Now they're having to embrace technology, and as a result, it's not so much that there's a gap between what we need and what the technology is. It's that we've closed that gap, and now we're dealing with, oh gosh, I've got systems that I've got to tame, not AI, that's
Yeah.
not going around like a Terminator necessarily, but systems that are not AI enabled, or just traditional systems. But it's like they're not really quite geared to how our business works,
Yeah, I
and
could see that.
and that is a major problem. And if somebody who's just starting out can start looking at tech like, okay, what's the business use of this, and start asking smart questions like that, boy, that's somebody who can get past the interview pretty quickly, I would imagine.
Mm. And something you just said there, made me think.
Yeah.
One of the biggest revelations was that, like, look, not everybody knows everything, and you were alluding to there that there's a lot organizations don't know about the tech they're deploying. You could say that the factors that have to be competitive, you have to innovate and to adopt the latest things. I think globally we have to be able to compete on a lot more global level. So adopting technologies can give you operational efficiencies or improvements of quality of life for your customers or workers. That rapid innovation, I say rapid innovation, probably hasn't been as rapid as you kind of alluded to there. But even basic things like putting something in the cloud that is exactly as it was in a data center is now all of a sudden exposed. These are the challenges organizations are wrestling with. You can
Big
go in
time.
and assume they have all the answers to it as well. But then if you kind of tackle it as how could we better just chase that problem? You mentioned don't be kind of snarky and like you can solve everything, because that doesn't work in a job interview. Those aren't the people you want to work with. But posing that
Yeah.
interesting question, that you're thinking about it in a certain way. You don't necessarily have to have all the answers, but you just kind of, what are you doing for
Sure.
this? Have you got a complete strategy? As soon as you've got a hiring manager kind of answering your questions and saying, no, that's a good point. We've kind of got this, but here's where we're lacking or something. That's a really great position to be in as an interviewee. And that's where we're going to have to cut it for this part one of our interview with James Stanger. And forgive me, I did call him James Stanger at the beginning. A lot of things going through my head of what we're going to talk about that I neglected to really clarify exactly how to pronounce his name. And as a man whose surname is Davis and is often pronounced Davies, I should know better. So I do apologize. Dr. James Stanger, thanks so much for taking the time to join us there. Really interesting, a lot of ground covered. Really starting to talk about the gaps that organizations face trying to fill in their cybersecurity portfolios. So really important stuff for you to understand so that you can be equipped to actually go and address those gaps as a cybersecurity professional. How to sell yourself, how to start to solve these problems. Because really, when you're entering cybersecurity, you look at the scale of the mountain to climb, you think, wow, that is massive. when you kind of get halfway up the mountain, you realize there's a lot more mountain to scale. And everybody, organizations, leaders, they're all there with you thinking, how on earth do we get to the top here? And then it keeps on growing that mountain as well. So really, it's a collaborative effort that we all need to take to actually fill these security gaps, achieve better outcomes, filling the outcome gaps, filling the resource gaps, filling the skills gaps. James does a great job at really stretching the definition of this cyber skills gap shortage and looking back to why it actually exists and the opportunities that it offers for people and organizations alike. So super interesting. What a great guy to have on the podcast. Thanks so much, James. We will be back again next week with a part 2, where we will dive into learning more about James himself, his career, how he started off as an English PhD student, becoming a technical editor, real early adopter of technology. He found himself then writing about cybersecurity, but going beyond what maybe some of the other people were doing and just interviewing a specialist. James really became a go-to guy and had people approach him to help design courses, which is really what created his current role today with CompTIA, where he helps inform and define fantastic courses that really help people getting to their first cybersecurity as well as other tech jobs or advance their career as well. So go check that out. That'll be coming next week. We do have a partnership with CompTIA. So if you want to come and join our community, type in Empirical Training School with a K. You'll find it. You can request to join. It's a free community, and you'll have access to some offers, some discounts with the CompTIA exam certification vouchers, or in fact the lab training that they provide as well as letting us help you define what pathways are right for you, what certifications you need to get. So a lot of benefits. Please jump in there, come find us, come talk to us. We're engaging with people on a regular basis. But that's it for this week, and we'll see you all in the next episode of Cyberspace. I've been Josh, and this has been Empirical Training.
I think that might be it. I think that's a wrap.
Cyberspace podcast.
Empirical training. You guys are cyber nerds. Do you know what I mean? So like, empirical training, that's a wrap.